Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Adrienne Esposito. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment. Welcome to the Clean Water Legislative Breakfast without the breakfast. So we'll just name it the Clean Water Legislative Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a lot of Assembly and Senate members and agency people, water suppliers and water treatment operators, and environmental advocates have all registered to participate this morning. And we're really appreciative of your time, and we're going to be mindful of your time as well. This collaborative is the Clean Water Coalition of New York State. And we started back in, I shouldn't even say back, and it wasn't even that long ago, in 2017. And it really is a collaboration between not only environmental organizations, but the wastewater treatment operators and water suppliers around New York State who came together and said, what can we agree on? What could be a shared agenda for clean water in the state of New York? And I have to tell you, New York has been much better off for this unique collaboration. Since the inception of the Clean Water Coalition, $5 billion, that was B with the B, has been allocated for clean water initiatives around the state, upgrading sewage treatment plants, improving water filtration systems for water treatment, and it's really, and water testing as well, septic replacements. So each year we meet, we have rigorous discussion about what else can New York do to further the goal of clean water for the residents. And that is the goal of this collaboration. And we developed every year, we develop a shared agenda for clean water in New York State. And that's what this forum is about. So we have only 5 speakers and a guest speaker, Ashley Doherty from the governor's office. Where we're going to talk about, well, except for the governor's office, but the advocates are going to be talking about problem and solution. So we always like to tell our elected members of New York State Assembly and Senate, what can you do to help advance clean water? Well, we have the answers for you today. Before we get started with that, though, I'd like to thank the steering committee, which is comprised of the New York State section of the American Water Works. It is the New York Water and Environment Association, the good folks who actually treat our wastewater, Riverkeeper New York, League of Conservation Voters, EA, Environmental Advocates, the Nature Conservancy, and the Adirondacks Council. Thank you for all the hard work you guys do and all the advocates that are members of this coalition, which are actually too many to name, but I see many of you on the forum today. Thank you again. I want to also thank the senators and assembly members. I can see many of you. Some of you have your camera off, you're a little camera shy, which is unusual for our elected representatives. But thank you for, participating this morning. So I'd like to turn this over to Ashley Doherty, who is the Deputy for Environment and Energy, Deputy Secretary for Governor Hochul. She's just going to talk about what the governor's vision of clean water entails for us in 2022. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
No, and thank you for having me, and good to see everyone. Yes, my name is Ashley Doherty. I am the Assistant Secretary for the Environment under Governor Hochul. And, this year we try to put forward a state of the state and a budget proposal that really puts both environmental spending and spending to support, clean water infrastructure and clean water in general in the budget. And, this has been done in a few different ways. I would, have to start with probably one of the biggest, announcements, and the biggest thing I know a lot of you will be working with us as a team together, which is the $4 billion Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Environmental Bond Act, with a much better name and a lot more money coming in. And as we all know, this funding will be crucial to supporting things like flood risk reduction, open space, climate change, and what we're here to talk today about, water quality improvement and infrastructure there. The Bond Act has grown, as has funding specifically for the water line. We've increased that by $100 million, totaling out at 650, which will be greatly, will be able to be used hopefully with federal funds and other different forms of, funding to really support our water infrastructure. the most important thing, is getting it over the finish line and then hopefully seeing it be successful come November, which I have all the faith in celebrating after that day. We've also included 500 million in additional resources for investments in clean water. This is now the 4th installment here. It's been used for, as we all know, drinking water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure, water quality protection, and this funding is vital to really support both our communities and making sure people have access to clean water. And on top of the funding, this year has been an historic year for the Environmental Protection Fund. That has increased by $100 million, which means that we're having $1 billion of extra investments over the next decade in environmental programs. And while, some of the numbers may seem smaller than, say, the 500 million for, water, this really does support a lot of these very important programs, specifically with, Ocean Great Lakes, but WQIP had one of the bigger investments there, and that can be used a lot by our smaller communities and, a lot of people on here to ensure that we're investing to deal with a lot of our septic issues or our HAB issues in those areas. And on that, I know, speaking of a lot of different areas, we've also tried to address, while all water areas are extremely important, specifically with some of the Long Island issues that have occurred, we will be moving, funding specifically for septic system replacements. That's not just a Long Island issue, that is statewide, but that funding that was a priority through the state, making sure there's more investments to look at what is happening with wastewater, not just, water quality, by helping improve what Stony Brook can be doing, allowing research to really guide our next steps. And that funding will be important to address some of the problems that are occurring with the wastewater issues. And then all out there in Suffolk County, which got to give some credit over to Adrian there too, we'll be dealing supporting the Suffolk County wastewater district and funding to help support and deal with municipal sewers and cesspools, which on here, if I talk about that issue outside of here, people are like, why are you so obsessed with septic systems? As we know, they are so important to make sure we are not putting bad stuff out into our water, creating higher, getting all the nitrogen in there, all the bad stuff, getting our HABs, making things really not drinkable either, or not swimmable in some areas. And, that's been a very important thing to make sure we are protecting both, the aquifer out there, as well as just our general water systems. But, this year we are, hearing from a lot of the advocates specifically on this call, and probably some of the members and people, and we appreciate a lot of the feedback and are thankful for your advocacy and your support in allowing, and really hopefully getting this over the finish line and, getting to some of these historic levels. So I just want to thank all of you for being on this morning, and thank you guys for your, support in helping us form this, what I say is a very exciting budget. And, we will continue to put environmental fund, support and clean water support to the forefront.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley.
No, thank you.
Yeah, and you don't have to feel bad about mentioning Suffolk County and septics in the same sentence. We do know that Suffolk County is the septic capital of the world.
That it is.
They do need a little extra help and a little extra love when it comes to clean drinking water. And we appreciate you and the governor knowing that. So that's great. And, I say that parochially because I live in Suffolk County. So I'm sorry I had to say it. Okay. So next, and thank you for your time. We appreciate you joining us. All right. Our next speaker is Judith Hansen from American Waterworks Association. Judith is going to talk about drinking water infrastructure needs for New York State. Who would know better than what we need to upgrade our drinking water infrastructure than AWWA? Judith, thank you so much for your time today.
Had to take myself off mute. Sorry about that.
Yes, please.
So thank you, Adrian, and good morning. I want to take the opportunity, and I want to thank Adrian for the opportunity to speak to you about New York's drinking water from the perspective of the water supplier. As Adrian mentioned, my name is Judy Hansen, and my day job is as the superintendent of the Kingston Water Department, and I am a volunteer and past chair of the New York State section of the American Waterworks Association. So let me just take 2 minutes to tell you a little bit about who the New York State AWWA is and what assistance we can provide to both the legislators and the governor's office. So we're a not-for-profit organization that represents New York State's drinking water professionals. And who are they? Well, they're water suppliers like myself who provide drinking water to over 18 million New Yorkers. They're also the engineers like Rob, who you're going to hear from in a minute, who design and construct our treatment systems and our distribution systems. And we also include scientists and academics who not only do leading research on new treatment technologies, but also, and maybe most importantly, are educating the next generation of water professionals. So the goal and the mission of AWWA is to provide leadership to the drinking water community to provide sustainable, safe water through the advancement of water system management, education, science, and technology. As Adrian suggested, we're your leading resource on drinking water, and we're always guided by the principle, our main core principle of public health protection. And to that end, we do provide some advocacy and leadership on behalf of the drinking water community. So I'm here to tell you what we as the drinking water community view as some of our challenges. So I think there's 10,000 drinking water systems that supply water to 18 million New Yorkers. And I think for most of us, the challenges fall into 3 separate categories. The first is infrastructure. The second is emerging contaminants, the lead and copper rule that's coming down from the federal government, and the establishment of MCLs, and we kind of view them as one. And water affordability, surprisingly, is also high on our agenda. So I want to just take a couple of minutes and kind of briefly describe what we view in each of those categories. So infrastructure. If I asked for a show of hands, I'm sure everybody's heard that in the next 20 years, there's 40 billion with a B worth of infrastructure issues facing the drinking water community in New York State. Well, that number has been often repeated, widely publicized, and it's a valid number, but I want to tell everybody what's not in that number. What's not in that number is any costs associated with emerging contaminants. What's also not in that number is any money for source water protection, which Tracy's going to talk about in a little bit. It doesn't include any costs about making our systems more resilient to climate change. That's a big issue for most of us, especially here in the Northeast. And finally, it's strictly, that 40 billion is strictly construction costs and really doesn't even touch the soft costs associated with construction and construction management. And they include engineering, which can be a full 20 to 25% of the cost of the construction. It doesn't include construction management, piloting that may be required, design studies, or in particular, this is an issue on Long Island, land acquisition. Land is very expensive in Long Island. Well sites are on very constrained, tiny sites. And when you have to put in AOP systems and granulated activated carbon and maybe even new generators to be able to power those systems, you need more land. And so that's another issue that's not in that number. My whole point here is to make sure that you understand that our needs are greater than 40 billion over the next 20 years. Let's talk about emerging contaminants and the lead and copper rule and MCLs. So modern water treatment in the United States goes back to the 1890s when the connection between waterborne disease and pathogen removal, microbial pathogen removal was first identified. And we got really good at it over the intervening 120 years. Waterborne illness is pretty much, there's some isolated exceptions to this, but pretty much gone. But what the next challenge is, and for the next several decades, is going to be dealing with emergent or legacy contaminants that have found our way into our source waters by previous industrial contamination, and quite honestly, inadequate zoning regulations in a lot of cases. The drinking water community is going to meet this challenge, but we're going to need your help. Since 1974 and the adoption of the Safe Drinking Water Act, And I know that despite the gray hair and my longevity in the business, I wasn't in the business in 1974. Water suppliers have been dealing with maximum contaminant levels set by our regulators, and we always have met them. You know, you set the regulation and we meet the challenge. But they've always been, and they need to continue to be, based on sound science, consideration of the best available technologies to remove that contaminant, and they need to have a robust cost-benefit analysis so that we make sure that that MCL is giving proven public health benefit. The concern that we have is that our ability to detect these contaminants at ever lower levels is far outpacing the toxicology associated with those contaminants. And so I think there's a perception that if we can set those MCLs lower, despite maybe not having the cost benefit analysis in there, we should. So we see this race to zero. That's not really wrong, but you need to understand if we do that, there's a cost associated, because the lower you set those levels, the more expensive it becomes. And that's an opportunity cost, because that's diverting money away from other things that may have greater public health protection benefit. So we just want you to be aware of that. If you set the MCL, we will meet it, but there is a cost associated with that, and you just need to understand that. Similarly, EPA's got the newly promulgated and ready for publication and finalization any day now, the new lead and copper rule revisions. We are very hopeful that the infrastructure bill passed by the federal government and signed into law by President Biden will provide us some help in getting that lead out. Because like you, we all agree there is absolutely no safe level of lead in our drinking water. But there's other aspects of this rule that are going to place a severe burden on tax our resources and our staff resources and our workload that to comply with this law, in terms of inventories, in terms of public websites, that we all good, but we need to understand that there's a cost associated with doing that, and we're going to have to up our staff levels, and that's also going to put an upward pressure on water rates. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the needs that we see the Department of Health and the state have. So in order for these new MCLs to really be effective and be implemented properly, we really advocating that the health department in New York State be provided with adequate staff resources. So I've noticed in my career over the past 20 years, their numbers have declined and their program responsibilities have increased dramatically. So you've got fewer people doing far more work. And they're also dealing with the brain drain, as people, like we all are, as experienced professionals retire, they're being replaced by entry-level people that are very steep on that learning curve. So, you know, that's an obstacle for them. The relationship between the water suppliers and the Department of Health, you might think is adversarial, but it's anything but. We're true partners. And we both work to protect the public health. So we're asking for the resources, just as we want the resources to be able to build those treatment systems and meet those MCLs and make our drinking water safer and better for the public. That they need to have the resources to be able to support, monitor, and regulate us. So without the addition of qualified personnel, I think they're going to be hard pressed to roll out these new MCLs efficiently and effectively, and that's going to further erode the public's trust in us, in our drinking water. Affordability is the last issue. I want to thank Governor Hochul and the legislature for all that they've done. In this current budget, there's $500 million that Governor Hochul has allocated for improvements for water infrastructure and wastewater projects. We're very encouraged by that. We would urge you not only to preserve this funding in the budget, but to increase it. And I know that's going to make Adrian smile a little bit, because we always need and want more money. We understand we're competing with other people and other valuable agendas, but drinking water and wastewater projects are really preeminent in there. despite the generous funding, there's going to be a gap between what the federal government is promising us, what the state has been generous in providing us, and water rates are going to go up. It's just a fact. And that's going to provide a disadvantage to some of our low-income customers, and that's going to make affordability a premier issue. So on behalf of the water suppliers in New York State, I'm pledging and telling you that AWWA is willing to work with both the legislature and the governor to find a solution to this problem that's workable for all of us, because this is a big problem and we need to work together. So as I close, I know Adrian's happy about that too, I want to call your attention to a couple of bills that we'd like you to think about. So the first is Senate Bill 3968 that's currently sponsored by Senator Hinchey and supported in a bipartisan way by Senator Tedesco. And this bill is going to provide CHIPS-like funding, if it's passed, for water, wastewater, and stormwater repair and rehab projects. And it's not going to be, the funds would not be allocated on a competitive application process, but based on a metric like miles of pipe. So it would be given toward communities for system size. Not only will it help maintain our existing infrastructure in those little often forgotten projects, pipes, valves, hydrants, but it's also going to allow municipal leaders to have a more hands-on, all-inclusive, complete streets approach. So instead of putting new water lines down Main Street today, new sewer lines down next month, and paving 3 years from now, it'll allow people to do the whole job all at once and make a much more efficient use of our money. So we would call your attention to that. We also would call your attention to Senate Bill 3104 that's sponsored by Senator Kaplan, and Assembly Bill 04172 that's sponsored jointly by Assembly members Levine, Avenatti, Fahey, and Stern, and that would exclude water district expenditures from the tax cap. That tax cap, the imposition of the tax cap restrictions gives a lot of municipal leaders a kick the can down the road, defer the maintenance, because we're competing in the budget process on a local level. So passage of this bill would provide an incentive for communities to invest in infrastructure improvements. And finally, we think we need to look at that priority ranking system for the allocation of grants and funds through the state and the revolving loan funds, because it's outdated and maybe should be re-examined. The current system places water suppliers and wastewater systems that are well managed, has full regulatory compliance, and our rates cover the costs of our operations at a disadvantage, and favors those systems that are just, managed from crisis to crisis. So we would recommend that you expand the criteria to include a regulation and a requirement that we have that those systems that get this money have asset management in place. We have demonstrable managerial and technical competence, and we have an appropriate rate structure that covers the cost of our services. And with that, I'm going to be quiet.
Okay. Thank you, Judith. If you could maybe put the number of those bills, the bill numbers in the chat for our elected representatives so they can see them just in case they miss them.
Awesome.
And thank you again. Though, just so everyone, all the participants know, when the presenters talk about this, this is all part of the shared collaborative platform that we all agree with. And just to be mindful, yes, we are advocating for more staff for DEC and more staff for the Department of Health. I mean, the mantra used to be, oh, we'll do more with less. But then we kept piling, the state kept piling more things on these agencies. And the truth is, the reality is you end up doing less with less after you complete all your efficiencies. So it's time to do more with more. And that is the reason for the ask for more staff for both of those key agencies and protecting our health and our environment. Okay, so moving on to drinking water, to wastewater infrastructure needs. We have with us today Robert Ospachuk from the New York Water and Environment Association, and this is the coalition of the wastewater treatment operators throughout the state of New York. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. Judy, thank you for talking so much about what AWWA does, because NYWA, New York Water Environment Federation, does all the same things on the clean water side. You know, what's getting discharged to our rivers and lakes from stormwater, from wastewater. So we do all the same things as far as our mission to treat and to train and to educate. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit of the numbers, you know, because the last time New York State did a needs assessment, and why is my slideshow not advancing? Was 2012. That was 10 years ago. A lot has happened, and Judy talked about emerging contaminants. We talked about resiliency. You know, just a couple of years ago, New York State passed some regulations, and when we look at water and wastewater, where are these facilities located? On the wastewater side, generally at the low points where things flood next to the rivers. That 2012 needs assessment that identified $31.5 billion for New York State 10 years ago didn't include all the resiliency. And these are new laws. In fact, I was looking at a wastewater treatment plant, I won't say where, and the new requirement would basically require a dike around the entire treatment plant or to demolish it and build a new one. Those are dramatic and drastic numbers that are now in law in New York State. And I can't wait to see, I understand that EFC and DEC are starting a 2022 needs assessment for New York, so we can see this. But if we take the 2012 numbers and we think about it over a 20-year period where a lot of people bond things for, you know, that's a $1.6 billion annual need. Let's think about that for a second, because New York State really is a leader. So thank you to all the public officials on this call. You know, you've done a great job providing funding and the resources for New York State utilities to really go out there and tackle some of these problems. And let's talk about them. You know, the Water Infrastructure Environment Act, $200 million. Intermunicipal grants, $15 million. Water quality improvement grants, $80 million. Green infrastructure, green projects, $20 million. Total grants right now in New York State really associated for wastewater, you know, over $300 million. We add to that the $1 billion that we can borrow with low interest or zero interest for certain communities, you know, that gets us to about 1.3 million, which actually is a funding gap that was identified 10 years ago. And we're doing a great job, you know, compared to other states, but the gap and the need is still there. So let's take in consideration the federal bipartisan infrastructure bill. So that's great. There's another $126 million in grants coming in, raising that to $441 million. Another $130 million coming into the SRF program. Guess what? We're just at the needs, the annual need and funding available in New York State that was required 10 years ago. And that doesn't take into consideration emerging contaminants on the wastewater side, which is really in the biosolids. It doesn't take into consideration the resiliency laws that New York State passed 3 years ago. So this need is much greater today. And I think we need to recognize that and just understand that. But thank you. You've been doing a great job to catch up. So what is the wastewater infrastructure need? And I think Judy, you know, talked a little bit about this. You know, we need to keep going forward with funding. The Clean Water, Clean Air, Clean Jobs Bond Act. You know, a lot of that money goes to infrastructure, which is greatly needed. But Judy alluded to that DEC and EFC, they're doing their best with the staff they have. And they're very helpful, they're very supportive of these communities. But as regulations change and the funding needs and the more funding becomes available, more and more happens. So we're seeing less people, we're seeing longer timeframes. You know, this industry needs new professionals. With this Clean Water, Clean Air, Clean Jobs Bond Act, can there be some sort of PR to pull people back in? You know, a lot of times when I see stuff supporting that, you see the solar power, you see the wind. You know, you don't see the people at the drinking water treatment plants, the wastewater treatment plants. We need people. And Judy talked about the training for these people. As technology changes, the requirements to hold those jobs goes up. They're more specialized, more computerized. You know, we're talking about AI in some of our wastewater treatment facilities. This is becoming a very, very technology-driven sector. And the investment into bringing the right people, or at least the right skills for these people into the sector, is need. And lastly, as Judy talked about on the drinking water side, rates are going to go up. If the funding is not available and the needs are there, and we know they're there, we need the education for the public. When we talk about, $4 per 1,000 gallons, or $6 or $8 per 1,000 gallons, yet someone complains about their water rate, because now it is a right in New York State to clean water, air, and land. But they're willing to go to Starbucks and pay $5 for a cup of coffee. There's a gap there on what's important. So education for the public has to come from somewhere. We try, both AWWA and NYWA, and I know every conservancy group on this call try, but it's fake. So that's all I have today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we know you try, and we appreciate the great job that you guys do, Robert. Okay, speaking of federal funds, Patrick McClellan from the New York League of Conservation Voters is going to talk about leveraging federal infrastructure, leveraging federal investment in clean water here in New York. We all know there was money in the Infrastructure Act. Hopefully there'll be more money as Congress gets around to maybe passing another bill or two this year. One can only hope. And there's more money in those bills. So Patrick, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, so because I want to close with positive news, I'll start with what has not passed yet. So the Buildback Better bill, just some headline numbers, has $9 billion for disadvantaged communities to remove lead from drinking water, $970 million for replacing lead service lines in rural communities, $225 million to help low-income households with their water bills, which we've been talking about. Several fairly large pots of money to deal with water reuse and reclamation projects, $500 million to the EPA for stormwater and sewer overflow projects, and $150 million for replacing or installing septic systems nationwide, though I'm sure that you could use a pretty substantial amount of that just in Suffolk County. So that bill, obviously is stuck in Congress, and who knows whether or not some version of it will pass in the Senate, where NYLCV is working with other LCVs in other states and with our National League of Conservation Voters to try and get something through. And, we're fairly optimistic that if something does get through the Senate this year, a lot of these water and climate provisions would still be included in it, because they frankly have not been the hang up with Senators Manchin and Sinema. And that obviously would be really helpful. The more positive news, though, is that we already have the largest federal investment in water infrastructure in decades, from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that passed last year. So in that, sorry, I have a toddler having a meltdown in the room with me.
Don't you just love Zoom things, Patrick? Don't worry about it. It's okay.
Okay, there we go. Now I'll continue. So in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, all of the water money there was going through the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Those are the main ways that the federal government funds water projects in the states. So just for some context here, since 1998, the federal government has awarded $1.36 billion to this New York State Drinking Water SRF. So that's in more than 20 years of that program existing. The bipartisan infrastructure bill added $11.7 billion to the National Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And then on top of that, again, this is just the drinking water SRF, $4 billion for emerging contaminants, $15 billion for lead service line replacement, and $4 billion for emerging contaminants. In the clean water SRF, there is $11.7 billion for the entire national SRF and $1 billion just for emerging contaminants. I don't think we have a good sense yet of how much of that money New York is going to get, although historically we do get a slightly larger share of the SRF money than you would expect based on our population size. And part of that too is because a lot of these federal funds are matching programs, and because New York is putting so much money into clean water and drinking water already, that puts us in a good place to be able to take advantage of these new funds. For instance, I think it's good timing that we have another bond act on the ballot this year, because the drinking water SRF was capitalized in the first place with the last environmental bond act that New York did. And some of that money has already started. So make sure that I have the right number here. So shortly after the bill was passed, Senator Schumer, like he always does, made sure to highlight the benefits for New York, and the EPA announced that $428 million was awarded to New York State for our 2 SRFs. In contrast, in 2020, we were awarded $220 million for the 2 SRFs. So our allocation was almost doubled just from the bipartisan infrastructure bill passing, and there is more on the way. So that's very exciting. And again, it's not going to meet all of our needs here, but it means that we're getting, significant help from the federal government to help with this. There's potentially more on the way if the Buildback Better Act or some version of it does pass the Senate this year. And I think that more broadly, the takeaway that we can have from these congressional negotiations is that clean water funding is both a bipartisan issue, and it's something that federal legislators are really starting to realize how important it is. I think that the crisis in Flint a few years ago helped to highlight that. The problems that we've had in New York State, in Hoosick Falls and in Newburgh have certainly elevated the issue nationally. And so I think that the good news, the reason for us to be optimistic on this, is that, I don't think that Congress is going to deprioritize clean water funding, even with this massive influx that we're getting. I think that this is an issue where, to make a very bad pun, there are going to be more opportunities to go back to the well.
Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate it. So yeah, let's just reiterate, clean water is a bipartisan issue, right? It's a public health issue. It's a quality of life issue. It's a popular issue. It's a necessary issue. This is not, an advocate's self-interest, right? This is really an issue that spans party lines, economic realms, and it literally is a necessity, not a luxury item for all of us. So, and I appreciate you raising also that the Environmental Bond Act, the timing is very good, because we can leverage that money, if supported by the voters this November, for more access to federal dollars and with the cost sharing component. It's very critical for us in New York. No one knows more about that than our next speaker, Jessica Otney Mahar, who's with the Nature Conservancy. Jessica is at the center of many environmental challenges throughout New York State. She leads the Environmental Protection Fund Coalition, Friends of EPF. She's championing the Environmental Bond Act, as well as many more things. Jessica, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adrienne, and thank you so much to CCE for hosting this forum and inviting the Nature Conservancy to be a part of it. And thank you to the so many elected officials and your teams who are here today and taking time out for this. There are so many pressing issues facing New York and our people right now, and we appreciate your continued work in support of public funding and new policies that protect and improve our water quality. And also thanks to our partners. Adrian just mentioned some of the work we're doing, and it's all in partnership with the environmental community, the labor community, the business community, local governments, and so many more. This isn't something that anyone can do alone, so we're glad to see so many people on this call. So I'm going to talk about two issues today, the Environmental Protection Fund and the Bond Act. And I will be brief as requested. The Environmental Protection Fund, many of you know, is the state source of funding for programs that you probably see in your community. Programs like farmland protection, land conservation and municipal parks, recycling, zoos and botanic gardens, waterfront revitalization, invasive species prevention, but also drinking water protection, water quality improvement, estuary programs. The fund was created in 1993 and has enjoyed bipartisan support over decades because it touches down in every single county in New York State and every borough of the city, and it improves our quality of life and our environment. This year, Governor Hochul proposed the largest ever environmental protection fund in her executive budget. Her landmark proposal to increase the Environmental Protection Fund by $100 million from $300 million to $400 million will advance our work to protect the environment and improve water quality around the state. And our organizations are enthusiastic and urging the legislature to support the $400 million EPF during budget negotiations. It marks a huge step forward on the path to achieving the environmental community's long-term goal of a $500 million EPF. Some important notes, because we know you're going into budget hearings and thinking a lot about the state's financial plan. There are no gimmicks in this year's proposal. There are no offloads of state agency staff costs into the capital fund. There are no sweeps of this funding, and for the first time since the financial crisis around 2011, the increased funding is backed by revenue. So the financial plan is actually anticipating a ramp up of spending to meet almost the same level of appropriation in a very short amount of time. And we're really enthusiastic about seeing this governor take that seriously. So not just appropriating the money, but getting it out the door into communities that you all care about. The EPF supports 350,000 jobs across New York because it supports industries including construction, agriculture, recreation, forestry, tourism, and more. And you know, these are $40 billion of the state's economy every year. So these types of commitments that are made in the budget every year are incredibly important for moving our state forward and also achieving sustainability. On the Bond Act, we're enthusiastic about moving forward with the Clean Water, Clean Air, and Green Jobs Bond Act for the November ballot. In her executive budget, Governor Hochul proposed to increase the measure to $4 billion, which will create more benefits in communities, including disadvantaged communities, where the Bond Act must focus at least 35% or more than $1 billion of spending. So we're urging the legislature to support the new name, which is more clear to voters and will really help people support it. It really does matter. So we're enthusiastic about that, as well as the increase to $4 billion. The Bond Act will provide $1.2 billion for programs and projects that reduce floods and also restore natural resources, which can, in turn buffer us from flooding. It will provide $1.1 billion for climate mitigation for projects like installing renewable energy efficiency upgrades, and also for addressing issues like urban heat island in communities through cooling centers and also through nature, through urban forestry. It'll also provide $650 million for open space conservation and recreational access. And those of you, particularly from Long Island, understand in the Syracuse area that land conservation is also source water protection and water quality. So there's even clean water benefits to that portion of the Bond Act. And then it'll provide $650 million for water quality improvement and resilient infrastructure, which is obviously everyone's favorite category here on this forum. It also has some unallocated funding, which we believe can help agencies ramp up spending and assign people to move these bond funds, which is important, as noted by our colleague from NYWA, who is talking about the need for agency staff in addition to these funds. And the Bond Act projects will really allow, as other folks have said, states, municipalities, and NGOs to leverage those federal dollars. So we're working to pull in as much of that federal infrastructure money to New York as we can and get the most bang for the buck. It's a great win for taxpayers when we can do that. It'll also create more than 65,000 jobs across New York State. Last year, we had AECOM analyze the $3 billion measure, and they did a deep analysis, and that's where that 65,000 jobs number comes from. We're working with them now to have them redo that analysis with the $4 billion, and we'll be able to share the new jobs data in the coming week or two. I will put this link in the chat if you want to learn more about these issues and more about our amazing coalition that's growing and supporting conservation funding and environmental funding in New York. You can visit cleanwaterandjobs.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. Appreciate it. A lot of good news here for you guys today. I don't want you to get spoiled here. I see Assemblyman Abenanti shaking his head yes. Okay. We only have 2 more speakers left. I just want to mention we will take some questions from elected representatives or their staff at the end. So after or as the last speaker is speaking, who is Dave Miller, just feel free to raise your hand on with the Zoom. Okay. Next, I'd like to introduce Tracy Brown. Tracy Brown is the executive director for Riverkeeper. She took the helm of Riverkeeper just a few short months ago, and we're delighted to have her. Her talents and her skills and the history of her work in New York and throughout Connecticut. That's what she brings to us, and we're happy to have it. Hi, Tracy, you're on.
Thank you, Adrian. I want to thank CCE and Adrian for this really important forum, and everyone who's joined us this morning to discuss these really critical issues and our partners. We're really looking forward to the work ahead. So, drinking water source protection. This issue is an environmental issue, a public health issue, and an environmental justice issue, as we've all learned through recent crises. We are looking at threats to our drinking water sources from climate extremes and unregulated contaminants. The Drinking Water Source Protection Program is New York's answer to move forward and stand up comprehensive action on the challenges that we're facing. And the priorities I'm going to touch on really briefly this morning are the need for sustained funding for this work, increased regulations of contaminants, and the importance of more widespread application of watershed rules and regulations. So just want to flag that New York City's watershed model really provides us an example of what can be done. We just this month had the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Memorandum of Agreement that provides the oomph behind the preservation that New York City has been able to pull off for the upstate watersheds, which provide drinking water for half of New York State residents when you look at all the service areas. So it's really an incredibly important part of our state drinking water infrastructure, but of course it's really focused on downstate. But it is an example of how watershed rules and regulations can be used, and they've been used effectively with this multifaceted protection approach that DEP is doing in collaboration with these reservoir communities. So this is the type of work that we would like to see across the rest of the state. Highlighting the impacts here, protecting water quality at the source, like they're doing with the New York City watershed, really is more cost effective. It's a lot cheaper. And in addition to being cheaper to implement, if we can, organize around the right methods for doing this work, we also see all these co-benefits around protecting the sources rather than treating at the end once things are already contaminated. This is an environmental justice issue because often what we're seeing is that especially the surface water reservoirs are upstream of the communities that are drinking from them. So there can be a real disconnect between the communities that, for whom their public health relies on protection of watersheds not having, decision-making authority over land use and what's happening upstream. So this is really a challenge, and it's our communities of color that we're seeing are disproportionately affected by being disconnected from their surface water reservoirs. So some of the issues that were addressed earlier, Judith and others touched on, we are seeing some of our drinking water sources continuing to decline. Some of that is impact of what we're seeing, and we'll see more of from the extreme weather from climate, which increases runoff and erosion, and the warming of those water sources themselves. So triggering, a more welcoming environment for harmful algal blooms. We also, have more awareness about legacy contaminants, but we also are still adding new contaminants, and we do need additional regulatory oversight. New York State is stepping up on PFASs. So that's really important and critical for public health. And we are, pushing for more regulation of the other contaminants that remain unregulated that are polluting our drinking water supplies. The Drinking Water Source Protection Program is this great new framework. I want to take a moment and give credit to Dan Shapley and the rest of the team at Riverkeeper, who've been working really hard for years on getting this framework stood up. It's a stakeholder-driven mechanism. And we are hopeful that this will help drive more investment in drinking water source protection through WQIP and other programs. Right now, the state is working on plans for more than 40 communities across New York. Watershed rules and regulations. This is an incredibly important piece, and we have here a picture of an outhouse, basically. So these watershed rules and regulations that are in place across the state are so old. Most of them are from the turn of the last century. And they address things like where you can put your outhouse or your privy. I mean, that's the focus of a lot of the rules that are in place. So there is a huge need to really lean into updating our watershed rules and regulations. This is essential. Right now, the Oswego Lake community in the Finger Lakes has a proposal in front of DOH. So we are hopeful that that will create another model on a smaller scale than New York City, a more achievable model that other communities can look to protect their source water. And then just in conclusion, just want to highlight the priority actions that Riverkeeper and our partners in this work are focusing on right now. As I said, it's updating super outdated watershed rules and regulations, which do have the full force of law behind them. So they're very important tools, especially where you have communities that are separated from local land use decisions around their drinking water sources. So we'd like to see a lot of work around that. That is dependent on funding. So just echoing my colleague's call for the full funding for the Clean Water Act and Clean Water Infrastructure Act that was mentioned. Echoing Judith's discussion about emerging contaminants and legacy contaminants. And we also have identified the climate smart communities as an opportunity to get people to look at their source water supply. There is a mechanism within climate smart communities to be considering that, but we haven't seen many communities taking advantage of that part of that program. So we wanted to flag that for people engaged in that work. And also just remind people that we do still have needs around mapping and the secret process. So this is for our agency reps out there, work to be done there. So with that, I will say thank you and pass it back to Adrian.
Thank you, Tracy. Appreciate all your hard work. I just want to say to our participants, what other forum can you attend where you get to see pictures of outhouses? Very special and unique.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Tracy. But speaking of outhouses, something that's not much above that is the topic of septic systems. And lots of folks, when they think about septic systems, they think about Long Island. That's not a claim to fame that we love, but it is not a problem or a challenge that's limited to Long Island. In fact, septic systems now are causing water quality challenges and problems throughout lakes throughout New York, including Lake George and other areas. And here to talk, our last speaker, but not the least speaker, we have David Miller, who's representing today the Adirondacks Council to talk about septic system replacement and improvement needs.
Thank you,
David.
Adrian, and thank you everyone here today. I'm the Clean Water Program Coordinator for the Adirondack Council, and we work extensively on clean water infrastructure issues and provided reports and working with local governments, septic system pollution, where we've published white papers on the topic there, and salt contamination. And our comprehensive effort on septic systems shows, as Adrian points out, there's serious water quality impacts throughout the Adirondacks from septic system pollution and contributing to harmful algae blooms. We don't recognize as much the large percentage of New Yorkers that rely on septic systems throughout New York State, and we applaud Governor Hochul's proposal to increase funding for this effort. It's very critical. But just some background, the New York State Septic Replacement Program to address failing septic systems in New York State provides $10,000 grants to homeowners to replace their systems, up to $10,000 to protect local quality. While this has been allocated over $100 million over the past 5 years, funds to these county-run reimbursement programs, other than Suffolk County, where it's been quite successful, has been very slow to be put in the hands of homeowners in the counties. In fact, New York State, through the implementation partnership with DEC and the Environmental Facilities Corporation, has only allocated $30 million to counties eligible for the program implementation. And again, while Suffolk County has been very successful and much more needs to be done there, allocations for the rest of the state is not meeting the need, and there is a great need. Let me quickly just show an example. This year, Essex County and Warren counties in the Adirondacks were only allocated several $100,000, while applications in the Warren County example exceeded those funds by more than 3 times the allotment this past fall. Currently in Warren County and Essex County, through the work of the Lake George Commission and Warren County, historic septic inspection programs are being planned to be put in place for Lake George shorelines and neighboring water bodies later this year. In fact, the Lake George Commission's meeting today on discussing their inspection program concept paper. These programs will exponentially grow the need for septic replacement funds in this region. It is estimated in Lake George alone, over 3,000 septic systems will be inspected under the program under the next 5 years, and data indicates that 20 need replacement. The math shows this dramatic need for increased funding for the program. Furthermore, the demand for this program statewide to give homeowners the financial support they need will only grow as more communities across the state put in programs to address the issue of failing septic systems. Additional water bodies and counties in the Adirondacks may turn to the Lake George Basin as a possible model for inspection programs, and we know they will face similar challenges and needs. So whether in the Adirondacks, Finger Lakes, Southern Tier, Hudson Valley, or Suffolk County, or other areas, there is a significant concentration of septic systems impacting water bodies, and existing funds already allocated must be distributed to meet that need. But in addition to that, the appropriation of new funds as proposed by the governor to meet this growing need is equally critical, and we have to move forward quickly on this issue. Homeowners need this type of financial assistance and support, just as wastewater treatment plant and communities do, and the growth of need is going up exponentially. Thank you very much, Adrian.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better myself, David. So we're going to take a couple questions. I see Assemblyman Abenanti's hand is up, but I want to say also to folks here, you know, the challenge here for us is that it's the year 2022, and we really think we should be able to treat our wastewater appropriately. We should have clean drinking water, and these programs are widely and strongly supported by the public. I've never, in my 30 plus years of doing this work, I've never heard one person ever say, my water is too clean. Okay, no one says that. So the more effort we put into this, the more finances we put into this, the better off we're going to be. The good news is we know how to treat wastewater. We know how to treat drinking water. What we need are the resources, the staff, then the finances, and the political will to do that. So we're going to go to Assemblyman Abenanti and then Assemblyman Steve Otis. Assemblyman Abenanti, you're first. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Adrian. Let me start by thanking you and all the people on this for getting together. I think it's really important that the environmental community speak with one voice and highlight the importance of clean water. My wife was a teacher a while back. She just retired, and she said that water will be the new oil. It will be the basis for so many battles around the world and in this country. And if we see what's going on in the rest of our country, where we see farmers fighting with residents, fighting with industry over the availability of water, it's starting in this country. And there are going to be wars around the world about water. So I think New York has to have a uniform policy and somebody in charge. So I want to take us to the next step. I think your program today was excellent. I think it lays out all of the issues. It lays out the solutions to each of those issues. But what I think is missing is a state entity in charge of clean drinking water. And I have two bills that I'm gonna shamelessly ask for support. There is a Water Resources Planning Council. I have a bill A2044, co-sponsored by Skoufis and Senator Skoufis in the Senate. So my bill is 2044. It's an attempt to rejuvenate the Water Resources Planning Council, give it an executive director, and give it some importance. It's kind of fallen by the wayside. I'm not even sure there are appointees on that board at the moment. So I want to try to get that going. Secondly, I'm asking for help. I have a bill that's about this thick. It's a couple of 100 pages. I haven't put it in yet.
Okay.
It would create a new department of clean drinking water in the state of New York. It would steal from the health department, the environment, the NCON, and from the Public Service Commission, various provisions. I think the health department should continue to do, water quality, so to speak. We need to preserve the sources of water. That's NCON. That's but we don't have anybody who's got the responsibility, who we can blame if there's a problem. I think you said there's 10,000 agencies out there that are so, and it's not just the problems you indicated. There's a problem of access to clean water. There's a problem of accessibility. There's a problem of sufficiency. I mean, there are parts in the sophisticated parts of this state, Westchester County, where our water departments go around with tankers filled with water to put out fire because there's not enough water in the. So it's a problem from every angle. So that's why I'm pushing the idea of.
Assemblyman, I think you muted yourself.
I was wondering why everybody was applauding. At any rate, that's the point. So if any of you would like to work with me on this, please get in touch with me, get in touch with my office. I really need help from people like you who understand all of the details. I've got the outline, the framework. I'd like to put something in quickly to get this conversation going. But I want to thank all of you for the great job that you've done today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Assemblyman Otis, we're going to give you the last word on this.
Well, thank you, Adrian. And, I'd say this is the happiest Zoom I've been on yet this year. And I just say the gang's all here because in addition to the great speakers, there are other environmental advocates that are on the Zoom that we've all worked together for years. And it's really an all-star crew. And everyone should take a moment and rejoice in what we have all done in the last decade or the last 7 years in terms of growing all these programs. And here are the two themes from today, which is number one, we have to continue to make the case that the need has not been met, that there are so many other things we need to do, and to push for these increases in funding we're getting at the federal and state level, which are great. And the governor has really stepped up with her proposals to throw more money into different of the different programs that we are behind. I'd make a special note about the federal funding, and it's very good that with the additional revolving loan fund money that's coming from the feds, there is added flexibility this time to divert some of that money to grants, which is a great thing and gives New York more flexibility to do things with that. I'm also going to make a special pitch for something that we have. The Assembly advocated getting in the Bond Act when it was first drafted in 2020, which is stormwater projects. And stormwater projects are, and we learned this in Ida, a real risk factor, not just for flooding, but for water quality as well. And so I'm going to be continuing to push for speeding up and growing the funding for stormwater funding. But you should all be, don't be complacent. There's more work to do, but we've come a long way, and it's because of all of the great voices, all of the great environmental groups that are on this call, pushing together year after year after year, making the case, and we're going to do it again in 2022. Thank you, Adrian, and thank you all.
Thank you, Assemblyman. So in conclusion, we have good news. The good news is we are making progress. Actually, an agency person told me that in the last 5 years, we've made more progress in upgrading our water infrastructure than we've made in the last 30. And you know, when agency people are excited, that's what I find exciting. So we have more to go, and we can do it. As I said earlier, the good news is we know how to do this. The challenge is we need the funding and the political will. So I'm very excited. We had 95 people on this Zoom. Thank you so much for everybody. We look forward to working in partnership with all of our elected leaders, our agencies, and the coalition for clean water for all of New York State. Thank you for your time and your work. We look forward to a 2022 legislative session, which should be about clean water. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.